Good Shabbos, everybody. Good Shabbos. So, in this week's Torah portion, we find God commanding Abraham to get moving. Lech lecha, go get your steps in. Go to the land that I'll show you. And Abraham does just that, packing up and making moves. We learned that at the time when God provided this instruction, that Abraham was already 75 years old. And the Torah tells us he ultimately lived to 175, just to give it some context, because I know last week we read about Noah living to 950, right? Abraham, only $175. So 75 is a pretty good chunk into it, okay? So as you can imagine, though, Abraham appears in the Torah, and it says, okay, he's 75 years old at this point. So the rabbis want to know what happened in the first 75 years of his life. What were they like? The Torah text is silent about them. So as we're now in week 3 of a renewed cycle of reading the Torah, I can't emphasize to you enough that the Torah text that we have is skeletal in nature. It doesn't have all the details. It requires explanation and elucidation. It's why the oral tradition developed, which in many ways is just as important as the written tradition, because it lays out how to enact what we find in the text and fills in narrative gaps. So one of the ways that the ancient rabbis helped to flesh out the Torah, adding some meat, if you will, to its skeletal bones, was through midrash. Now, I like to think of midrash as ancient rabbinic fan fiction. Our ancestors creating backstories and creative narratives to help us read between the lines. And there is a ton of midrash as it relates to Abraham, his first 75 years of life, why he was chosen, and more. There are midrashim that speak of his secret birth, his being left in a cave by himself as a newborn by his mother, afraid that he would be slaughtered by the evil king Nimrod. Abraham having an encounter with the angel Gabriel only days old, and yet being able to understand God's oneness and being able to walk and talk after only 20 days. Maimonides teaches that as soon as Abraham was weaned, he commenced to busy his mind, and in his infancy, he commenced to think by day and by night and would encounter this enigma. How is it possible that this planet should continuously be in motion and have no leader? And who indeed causes it to revolve, it being impossible that it should revolve itself? Abraham knew that there is one God who leads the planet, created everything, and there is no other. This is still Maimonides speaking. And when Abraham was 40 years old, he recognized his creator. And he then started to work to convince others of this and found success. And when he had them subdued by his well-supported contentions, apparently they thought he was a great arguer, the king tried to put him to death, but he was saved by a miracle. So what's this business about the king trying to put Abraham to death and him being saved? Well, you may be familiar with a midrash that talks about how one day Abraham's father put him in charge of the family idol shop. And Abraham, not really impressed with the idols, decides to play a little game, takes a huge stick, puts it in the hand of the largest idol, after he goes and smashes all of the other idols with it. And when his father returns home and says, "What happened here?" Abraham said, "He did it." And obviously, his father was not impressed or convinced with this response. But often we stop telling the story there, because what happens next is a bit disturbing and is a little more midrash that I'm going to share with you this morning. So Terach, it says, his father seized him and delivered him to Nimrod, the evil king we heard about earlier. "Let us worship fire," Nimrod said. At the time, fire was kind of the god concept in that part of the ancient world. Avram says, "Let's worship water, which quenches fire instead." Nimrod said, "Okay, let's worship water." And Avram says, "Let's worship the clouds. Those are what give us the water." And then Nimrod says, "Okay, so we'll worship the clouds." And Abraham says, "No, we'll worship the wind, which disperses the clouds." And Nimrod said, "Okay, let's worship the wind." And Avram says, "No, let's worship human beings. We can stand up to the wind and not be blown over." And Nimrod basically says, I don't like these word games. We will worship nothing but the fire, and I'm going to throw you into it and let your God who you adore come and save you from it. So they throw Abraham into a fiery pit. Now, Abraham had brothers. Don't know if you know this. Now, Haran, Abraham's brother, was standing there, undecided, the Midrash tells in this story. If Abraham's victorious, I'll say I believe Abraham. But if Nimrod's victorious, I'll say that I believe Nimrod. Okay? So when Abraham is thrown into the fiery furnace and ultimately is saved, according to the Midrash, Nimrod asks his brother, who are you going with? And he's like, I'm going with Abraham. He's in the fire and not getting burned. And then the Midrash says that his brother Haran was thrown into the fire and was burned in the presence of his father, who was there and had brought Abraham in the first place. Dark, right? There's a Darren Aronofsky movie in there somewhere, right? Like this is dark stuff, but it's trying to get to this essence of Abraham as this person of faith who's going and challenging the king, saying, no, what you're saying about God is not fire. God is so much more above and beyond. This is the miraculous occurrence, Abraham being thrown in the furnace and coming out, that Maimonides is referring to when talking about the miracle. And the rabbis teach that Abraham continues to spread monotheism, often suffering consequences as a result. More Midrash. In the Talmud, Rav Chanan bar Rava says, attribution's important, right? Our forefather Abraham was imprisoned for 10 years during those first 75 because he rejected the idol worship that was accepted in his land. And there are even additional midrashim suggesting that during these earlier years, Abraham went, this one blew my mind, Abraham went and spent time learning from Noah and Shem, who, if you do the biblical math, were both still alive during Abraham's lifetime. So this week and every week, I encourage us to not only examine the Torah text itself, but to start identifying questions that you would love answers to that don't seem to be present in the text itself. And then to start looking into potential answers that were offered by our ancestors. And if we don't find any that are satisfying, or even if we do, to perhaps get creative. Compose your own midrash this week. See how it feels. And then I invite you to share it with me, and maybe even with our community. And in this way, we can all engage with the Torah's narratives, even the super challenging or truly skeletal ones, and continue the millennia-old Jewish tradition of interpreting and finding meaning in our sacred texts. So lech lecha, let's get to it. Shabbat shalom.